Welcome to Truth Behind History. If you enjoy learning about the battles that shaped the world, the victories, the defeats, and the sheer destruction, then this is the video for you. Today, we're diving into the most devastating battles in history, conflicts that didn't just claim lives, but changed the course of nations, toppled empires, and redefined warfare. So, why study these battles? Warfare isn't just about brute force, it's about strategy, resilience, and global power shifts. The lessons from history's deadliest conflicts still influence military tactics, geopolitics, and even modern warfare. This video will take you from the blood-soaked fields of ancient Rome to urban combat in the 20th century, showing just how high the cost of war can be. So, let's get into it. Here are history's most devastating battles. Hannibal's masterstroke at Cannae. In the summer of 216 BCE, Rome sent one of the largest armies it had ever assembled to crush Hannibal once and for all. With around 80,000 troops, the Romans were confident they could overpower the Carthaginian forces, who had roughly half their numbers. But Hannibal was no ordinary commander. He understood something crucial: numbers alone don't win battles. Strategy does. Hannibal lured the Romans into a trap with a tactic that would later be studied by generals for centuries: the double envelopment. He positioned his weakest troops, the Gauls, at the center of his formation, while his strongest forces, including his elite cavalry, were placed on the flanks. As the battle began, the Roman legions, believing they had the advantage, charged forward, pushing Hannibal's center backward. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Romans surged ahead, they failed to notice that their flanks were now exposed. At the perfect moment, Hannibal's cavalry swept around from the sides and completely encircled the Roman forces. The Romans, packed tightly together, had nowhere to escape. The battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse. Roman soldiers were cut down in massive numbers, many suffocating under the weight of their own comrades as they collapsed in the chaos. Estimates suggest between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers perished in a single day, one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The impact of this battle was devastating for Rome. Panic spread throughout the Republic, and many of Rome's allies began questioning whether they should stay loyal or switch sides to Hannibal. But despite this catastrophic loss, Rome refused to surrender. Instead, they adapted, avoiding direct battles with Hannibal and adopting a war of attrition. In the long run, Rome would recover and eventually defeat Carthage. But Cannae remained a testament to Hannibal's military genius. His tactics have been studied in military academies for centuries, proving that sheer numbers mean nothing if they are not used strategically. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings. In the year 1066, one battle decided the future of England, the Battle of Hastings. On one side was Harold Godwin's son, the newly crowned Anglo-Saxon king, leading a strong but exhausted army. On the other was William, Duke of Normandy, a man with a claim to the English throne and a well-prepared invasion force. Harold's army had just marched over 200 miles south after fighting off a Viking invasion in the north. Despite their exhaustion, they took a strong defensive position on Senlac Hill, forming a shield wall, one of the most effective defensive formations of the time. William knew breaking through this formation head-on would be a disaster, so he had to get creative. The battle began with Norman archers firing volleys of arrows, but the shield wall held firm. Then came the cavalry and infantry assaults, but time and time again, the English repelled them. Then William made a bold move. He ordered some of his troops to fake a retreat. Thinking the Normans were fleeing in panic, parts of Harold's army broke formation and chased after them. That's when the trap was sprung. The moment the English forces left their defensive position, the Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut them down. This tactic was repeated multiple times, weakening Harold's army. As the day wore on, the shield wall began to break, and William's forces gained the upper hand. In the chaos, Harold was struck down, some accounts say by an arrow to the eye, others claim he was cut down by Norman knights. Regardless of how he died, his fall meant one thing: England belonged to William. With this victory, William became known as William the Conqueror, and England was forever changed. Norman rule introduced feudalism, reshaped the English legal system, and even influenced the English language, blending Anglo-Saxon with Norman French. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just about who would sit on the throne, it was the moment that set England on a new cultural and political course that still impacts the country today. Mongol destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate. In the year 1258, one of the most devastating sieges in history unfolded as the Mongols descended upon Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world. At the time, Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a center of learning, culture, and wealth. But to the Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, it was just another city to conquer. The Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, underestimated the Mongols' strength and refused to surrender. In response, the Mongols surrounded Baghdad and began a brutal siege. For days, Mongol catapults rained destruction upon the city, battering its walls until they finally collapsed. When the Mongols breached the defenses, what followed was a massacre on an unimaginable scale. Historical accounts estimate that between 200,000 and 2 million people were slaughtered in just a few days. The Mongols showed no mercy. Scholars, doctors, poets, and civilians alike were put to the sword. But the most catastrophic loss was the destruction of the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries of the medieval world. Thousands of priceless manuscripts, containing knowledge from centuries of Islamic, Greek, and Persian scholars, were thrown into the Tigris River. According to legend, the river ran black with ink from the destroyed books and red with the blood of the slain. This wasn't just the fall of a city, it was the end of an era. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once been the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, was wiped out in a matter of days. The Mongols executed the Caliph by rolling him in a carpet and trampling him with horses, as they believed spilling royal blood on the ground was bad luck. With the destruction of Baghdad, Islamic civilization suffered a massive setback. The Mongols' dominance over the Middle East was cemented, and the power vacuum they left behind altered the region's political landscape for centuries. Baghdad, once one of the greatest cities in the world, would never fully recover its former glory. The fall of the Abbasid Caliphate stands as one of the most brutal examples of Mongol warfare and the devastating consequences of unchecked military conquest. Turning point in World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, aiming to capture key cities and destroy Soviet resistance. One of the most critical targets was Stalingrad, a major industrial hub on the Volga River. But what was meant to be a swift victory turned into one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles in history. As German forces advanced, the Soviets refused to surrender, turning the city into a fortress. Every building, every street, every pile of rubble became a battleground. The fighting was so intense that soldiers sometimes fought over a single apartment floor, with Germans occupying one level and Soviets another. This was urban warfare at its most extreme, with both sides engaging in close-quarters combat, snipers lurking in shattered buildings, and artillery reducing entire blocks to dust. By the winter of 1942, the tide began to turn. The Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive, encircling the German Sixth Army inside the city. Cut off from supplies, freezing, and starving, the German troops held out for weeks, but surrender became inevitable. In February 1943, the remaining 91,000 German soldiers surrendered, out of an original force of over 300,000. The cost of victory was staggering. Stalingrad had suffered almost total destruction, and the combined casualties exceeded 2 million, making it one of the deadliest battles in history. But beyond the numbers, Stalingrad was a turning point. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. From this point on, the Nazis were on the defensive, retreating as the Red Army pushed westward. Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union died in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. This battle wasn't just about territory, it was a psychological and strategic blow to Nazi Germany, marking the beginning of its downfall in World War II. World War I trench warfare at its worst, Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme, fought in 1916, is remembered as one of the most horrific and futile battles in military history. It was a perfect example of the brutal nature of trench warfare, where thousands of men died for mere yards of ground. The British and French launched the offensive against German positions along the Somme River, aiming to relieve pressure on the French forces fighting at Verdun. The battle began on July 1st, and what followed was pure carnage. The British forces believed their week-long artillery bombardment would destroy the German defenses, but they were wrong. When the attack began, the British soldiers advanced across no man's land, expecting little resistance. Instead, they were met with a hail of machine gun fire. In just one day, nearly 57,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, the worst day in the history of the British Army. For months, the battle raged on. Mud-filled trenches, barbed wire, and artillery shells turned the battlefield into a nightmarish wasteland. This was one of the first battles where tanks were introduced, but mechanical failures made them largely ineffective. The battle lasted until November, and after 140 days of fighting, the Allies had only gained about 6 miles of territory. The final casualty count? Over 1.2 million men killed or wounded. The Battle of the Somme became a symbol of the senseless slaughter of World War I. Despite the staggering losses, the war dragged on for 2 more years. This battle highlighted the devastating consequences of outdated military tactics being used against modern weapons. The Somme was supposed to be a breakthrough, but in the end, it was just another bloodbath in the trenches of the First World War. Largest tank battle ever, Battle of Kursk. By the summer of 1943, the German army was desperate to regain the momentum on the Eastern Front after their catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. Their plan? A massive offensive to cut off a Soviet bulge in the front lines near the city of Kursk. What they didn't realize was that the Soviets were expecting them, and what followed would be the largest tank battle in history. The Germans launched Operation Citadel in July 1943, sending nearly 800,000 troops and over 2,700 tanks into battle, hoping to break through Soviet defenses. But the Soviets had turned Kursk into a fortress. They had laid nearly 1 million mines, dug deep defensive positions, and deployed over 3,600 tanks of their own. When the German offensive began, they immediately ran into a wall of resistance. The battle quickly turned into a clash of steel, with thousands of tanks engaging in close-quarters combat. At Prokhorovka, one of the most intense tank battles ever recorded took place, with tanks fighting at point-blank range, ramming into each other in a chaotic frenzy. The German Tiger and Panther tanks were powerful, but Soviet T-34s were more maneuverable and easier to repair, giving them an edge in the long run. After a week of brutal fighting, the Germans realized they had lost. They had suffered over 200,000 casualties and lost a significant number of their elite panzer divisions. On the Soviet side, over 800,000 soldiers had been killed or wounded, but they had stopped the German advance for good. The Battle of Kursk marked the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Soviet Red Army began its unstoppable push toward Berlin. Kursk proved that the days of Nazi Germany dictating the terms of battle were over. The momentum had shifted permanently, and the war in the East would now be fought on Soviet terms. The fall of Nazi Germany, Battle of Berlin. By April 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin, and Adolf Hitler was hiding in his underground bunker, refusing to accept the inevitable. What followed was one of the most intense urban battles in history, as the Red Army launched its final assault to bring down Nazi Germany once and for all. The Soviets threw everything they had at the city. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops, backed by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, smashed through German defenses. The fighting was brutal, street by street, building by building. The Germans, many of them old men and teenage boys conscripted into last-minute militia units, fought with desperation, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Soviet artillery turned entire neighborhoods into rubble, while snipers, machine guns, and flamethrowers made every block a bloodbath. By the end of April, Soviet troops reached the Reichstag, the heart of Nazi power. Fierce combat raged inside the building, but eventually, the Soviets raised their red banner over the Reichstag, a moment that symbolized the fall of Hitler's empire. Inside his bunker, Hitler realized there was no escape. On April 30, 1945, he took his own life, bringing an end to his reign. Berlin officially surrendered on May 2, but the battle left the city in ruins. Over 1.3 million people had died in the fighting, including countless civilians caught in the crossfire. But beyond the destruction, the battle had far-reaching consequences. Nazi Germany was finished, but a new global conflict was already brewing, the Cold War. Berlin, now divided between the victorious Allies, would become the front line of ideological conflict between the Soviet Union and the West for decades to come. The Battle of Berlin wasn't just the end of World War II in Europe, it was the beginning of a new world order, one that would define global politics for the second half of the 20th century. 872 days of starvation and resistance, Siege of Leningrad. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, its forces blitzed through Soviet territory with terrifying speed. One of Hitler's key objectives was Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg, a major Soviet city with immense strategic and symbolic value. But instead of storming the city, the Germans took a different approach. They surrounded Leningrad and sealed it off, beginning one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history. For nearly 900 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, the people of Leningrad endured starvation, freezing temperatures, and relentless shelling. Hitler's plan wasn't just to conquer the city, it was to wipe it off the map. The Nazis deliberately cut off food, water, and supplies, hoping to starve Leningrad's population into surrender. What followed was a humanitarian catastrophe. At the height of the siege, residents were rationed as little as 125 grams of bread per day, most of which was made of sawdust. With no food coming in, people resorted to eating anything they could find: pets, leather belts, and even wallpaper paste. There were even reports of cannibalism as desperation took hold. By the time the siege ended, over 1.5 million people had died, more than the combined military and civilian deaths of the United States and the United Kingdom in the entire war. And yet, through all of this, Leningrad never surrendered. Despite relentless bombing and starvation, the people of the city held on. Supplies trickled in through the frozen Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, providing just enough food and ammunition to keep the city from collapsing. Finally, in January 1944, the Soviet Red Army broke through the German lines and ended the siege. The Siege of Leningrad was one of the most tragic yet defiant moments of World War II. It showcased the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute horror. While the city was left devastated, its refusal to surrender became a symbol of Soviet endurance, and its people were forever honored for their sacrifice and resistance. The Pacific's deadliest battle, the Battle of Okinawa. By April 1945, World War II was nearing its end, but the fighting in the Pacific was far from over. The Battle of Okinawa, the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, was about to begin. This wasn't just another island battle, it was the last major fight before a planned invasion of Japan itself, and both sides knew it. The battle began on April 1, 1945, when over 180,000 American troops landed on the beaches of Okinawa. But unlike previous battles, the Japanese did not meet them head-on. Instead, they retreated into the island's mountains and caves, setting up an extensive network of bunkers and tunnels. What followed was 82 days of some of the most intense combat the world had ever seen. The Japanese defense was relentless. They launched brutal nighttime counterattacks, hid inside fortified caves, and deployed a horrifying new weapon, kamikaze pilots. Waves of suicide planes crashed into U.S. ships, sinking dozens and killing thousands of sailors. On the ground, the Americans faced a hellish fight, advancing inch by inch against an enemy that refused to surrender. Rain and mud turned the battlefield into a nightmare, with soldiers struggling through treacherous terrain while under constant machine gun and artillery fire. By the time Okinawa was finally secured in June 1945, the casualty numbers were staggering. Over 240,000 people had died, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers, 12,000 American troops, and tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians, many of whom were caught in the crossfire or forced to commit suicide by Japanese propaganda that claimed the Americans would show no mercy. Okinawa was a turning point. The sheer ferocity of Japanese resistance convinced American leaders that invading Japan would cost millions of lives. This battle directly influenced the U.S. decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hoping to force a surrender without a ground invasion. The Battle of Okinawa wasn't just another fight in the Pacific, it was the last, bloodiest warning of what was to come if the war continued. The fall of the Aztec Empire, the Siege of Tenochtitlan. In 1521, one of the most dramatic clashes of civilizations in history unfolded as the Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, laid siege to the great Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. What had once been one of the most powerful and advanced cities in the Americas was about to fall, not just to superior weapons, but to disease, betrayal, and sheer desperation. Tenochtitlan was a marvel, a sprawling metropolis built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, with canals, causeways, and towering temples. It was larger than any European city at the time, but by the time the siege began, the city was already reeling from the devastation of smallpox, which had wiped out nearly half of its population. The Spanish had also allied themselves with thousands of indigenous warriors, many of whom had long suffered under Aztec rule and saw an opportunity for revenge. The siege lasted for months. The Spanish cut off the city's causeways, trapping its inhabitants and cutting off their food and water supply. Inside, famine and disease spread rapidly. Desperate Aztecs resorted to eating anything they could find, rats, insects, even leather from their shields. At the same time, Spanish cannons and native allies launched relentless attacks, slowly tearing the city apart. When the final assault came, it was a massacre. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured as the Spanish forces destroyed what remained of the city. By the time the siege ended, an estimated 240,000 Aztecs had died. The city, once a jewel of Mesoamerican civilization, was left in ruins. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spanish rule over what would become Mexico. It was one of the most significant turning points in history, as European conquest reshaped the entire continent, bringing with it new technology, religion, and political systems, at the cost of millions of indigenous lives. The legacy of this battle still echoes today in the cultural and historical identity of Mexico. Mongol Massacre, Siege of Gurganj. If there was one army that left a trail of destruction wherever it went, it was the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan, they built one of the largest empires in history, and they did it with brutal efficiency. No city learned this lesson harder than Gurganj, a wealthy center of the Khwarezmian Empire, which faced complete annihilation in 1221. The Mongols had already torn through the empire, defeating one city after another. But when they reached Gurganj, they encountered fierce resistance. The city's defenders fought desperately, knowing what was at stake. The Mongols, frustrated by the prolonged battle, decided that if Gurganj wouldn't fall quickly, they would make an example out of it. Once the city was finally captured, what followed was one of the greatest massacres in history. Estimates suggest that over 1 million people were slaughtered. The Mongols didn't just kill the soldiers, they wiped out the entire population. Men, women, and children were executed en masse. The Mongols even diverted a river to drown the remaining survivors, ensuring that Gurganj would never recover. But why such brutality? The Mongols were sending a message. They wanted other cities to surrender without a fight, and the utter destruction of Gurganj ensured that many did. The psychological warfare was just as effective as their actual military strength. By the time the Mongols left, Gurganj had been erased from history. A thriving city, once a center of trade and culture, was reduced to ruins. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire marked the beginning of their dominance over Persia and Central Asia, leaving a legacy of terror that would be remembered for generations. A crushing German victory, Battle of Kiev. In the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history, aiming to conquer the Soviet Union. One of the first major clashes of this campaign was the Battle of Kiev, and it turned into one of the most devastating defeats the Red Army had ever suffered. As the Germans advanced toward the Ukrainian capital, Soviet forces were ordered to hold their ground at all costs. But what they didn't realize was that they were walking into a trap. The Germans executed a massive encirclement maneuver, using their superior mobility to surround the Soviet troops. As the noose tightened, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves cut off, with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no way to escape. Desperate attempts were made to break out, but the Germans crushed every effort. The battle turned into a bloodbath as Soviet troops were bombarded by artillery, strafed by aircraft, and relentlessly attacked by German panzer divisions. Starving, exhausted, and out of ammunition, entire Soviet divisions were wiped out. When the battle finally ended in September 1941, it was the largest encirclement in military history. Over 760,000 Soviet soldiers were either killed or captured, and the city of Kiev fell to the Germans. This devastating loss had a massive impact on the Eastern Front. The destruction of so many Soviet forces gave the Germans a clear path toward Moscow, bringing them dangerously close to victory. But despite this crushing defeat, the Soviet Union refused to collapse. Over time, they rebuilt their forces, learning from their mistakes and preparing for a long, grinding war. While the Germans celebrated their victory at Kiev, they had unknowingly set themselves on a path toward disaster. The time and resources spent in Ukraine delayed their advance on Moscow, giving the Soviets just enough breathing room to regroup. What seemed like an unstoppable blitzkrieg in 1941 would soon turn into a desperate retreat as the Red Army began to push back. The longest battle of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Battle of Shanghai. In August 1937, one of the bloodiest battles of the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in Shanghai. This wasn't just a fight over a single city, it was a desperate attempt by China to slow down the unstoppable Japanese war machine. At the time, Japan had one of the most advanced and disciplined armies in the world, while China, though numerically superior, was struggling with outdated weapons and internal divisions. The battle began when Chinese forces launched a surprise attack on Japanese positions in the city. At first, it seemed like they had the upper hand, but the Japanese quickly regrouped and unleashed their full military might. What followed was over 3 months of brutal, close-quarters combat as both sides fought block by block, street by street. Unlike previous wars, where battles were mostly fought in open fields, Shanghai became a symbol of the new, urban style of warfare that would define modern conflicts. China poured everything it had into the defense of the city, even sending its best-trained divisions, including the elite 88th Division, to hold the front lines. But the Japanese had superior firepower, using artillery, tanks, and aerial bombings to level entire sections of the city. The skies were filled with the roar of Japanese warplanes, while the streets below became killing fields where thousands died every day. Despite their bravery, the Chinese eventually couldn't hold out any longer. By November, Japanese reinforcements had arrived, and they overwhelmed the defenders. When the city finally fell, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians were either executed or sent to brutal labor camps. The fall of Shanghai opened the path to Nanking, where one of the worst atrocities of the war, the Nanking Massacre, would soon take place. The Battle of Shanghai was a turning point. It proved that China was willing to resist, even at an enormous cost, and it showed the world just how brutal Japan's expansion would become. Though China suffered a devastating loss, Their fierce resistance in Shanghai marked the beginning of what would become a long and grueling war of attrition against Japan. A 21-year siege, the Battle of Candia. Few battles in history have lasted as long as the Siege of Candia. Spanning more than 2 decades from 1648 to 1669, this was one of the longest sieges ever recorded. The city of Candia, located on the island of Crete, was the last Venetian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean, and the powerful Ottoman Empire was determined to take it. The siege began when Ottoman forces landed on Crete, quickly overrunning most of the island. But the Venetians refused to surrender Candia, reinforcing its walls and preparing for a long resistance. The Ottomans, expecting a quick victory, bombarded the city with heavy artillery and launched repeated assaults. However, the Venetian defenders, aided by reinforcements from European allies, managed to hold the walls against wave after wave of Ottoman attacks. As the years dragged on, the siege turned into a grueling war of attrition. Disease and starvation ravaged both sides. Thousands of soldiers and civilians inside the city perished from hunger and outbreaks of the plague. Meanwhile, the Ottomans suffered massive losses from failed assaults and supply shortages. Despite reinforcements from France and other European states, the Venetians could not hold out forever. By 1669, after 21 years of relentless fighting, the Venetians could no longer sustain the defense. The Ottoman forces had worn them down, and Venetian commander Francesco Morosini negotiated a surrender. The defenders were allowed to leave the city with their weapons, and in exchange, the Ottomans took full control of Crete. The Siege of Candia was one of the costliest in history, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. It marked the decline of Venetian power in the eastern Mediterranean and solidified Ottoman dominance in the region. Though often overshadowed by other great sieges, this battle stands as a testament to the sheer endurance and determination of both the besieged and their attackers. Bloodshed in the Taiping Rebellion, the Third Battle of Nanking. By the mid-1800s, China was in turmoil. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, had been raging for over a decade. At the heart of this rebellion was the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, a religious and political movement that sought to overthrow the ruling Qing dynasty. By 1864, the rebellion was nearing its end, and the Qing forces set their sights on Nanjing, the Taiping capital. What followed was a brutal siege that would mark the final chapter of one of the deadliest uprisings ever recorded. For months, the Qing army surrounded Nanjing, cutting off its food and water supplies. Inside the city, the situation grew desperate. Disease and starvation spread rapidly as civilians and soldiers alike struggled to survive. The Taiping leaders, once confident in their movement, were now divided and disorganized. Meanwhile, the Qing forces, bolstered by foreign military advisors, were preparing for a final assault. When the Qing army finally breached the city walls, all hell broke loose. What followed was one of the most merciless massacres in Chinese history. Thousands of Taiping soldiers and civilians were slaughtered in the streets. The city, once a thriving stronghold of rebellion, became a battlefield of blood and smoke. The Taiping leader, Hong Xiuquan, had already died from illness before the final assault, but his followers fought to the bitter end. Those who weren't killed in combat were executed or forced into slavery. By the time the battle ended, hundreds of thousands lay dead, and the Taiping rebellion was effectively crushed. The fall of Nanjing marked the complete defeat of the movement, bringing an end to a conflict that had killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people. While the Qing dynasty survived, it was left severely weakened, and the rebellion exposed the deep cracks in China's imperial system. The Third Battle of Nanjing wasn't just the end of a rebellion, it was a warning of the greater instability that would continue to plague China in the decades to come. The Qing had won this war, but their days as rulers were numbered. Vietnam War's largest conventional battle, the Easter Offensive. By 1972, the Vietnam War had been raging for nearly 2 decades. The United States had begun withdrawing its troops, shifting more responsibility to the South Vietnamese military. But as American forces scaled down their involvement, North Vietnam saw an opportunity. What followed was the Easter Offensive, the largest conventional battle of the entire war, as North Vietnamese forces launched a massive, coordinated assault across South Vietnam. The offensive began in March, with over 120,000 North Vietnamese troops launching attacks on multiple fronts. Unlike the guerrilla tactics that had defined much of the war, this was a full-scale invasion, complete with tanks, artillery, and large infantry divisions. Their goal was to crush the South Vietnamese military, destabilize the government, and force the United States into accepting unfavorable peace terms. The initial attacks caught the South Vietnamese off guard. Entire cities were overwhelmed, and key defensive positions crumbled under the sheer force of the North Vietnamese advance. But as the offensive progressed, the South Vietnamese, heavily supported by American air power, began to regroup. US bombers launched relentless airstrikes, targeting enemy positions and supply lines. The infamous B-52 bombers devastated North Vietnamese troops, turning the tide of the battle. After months of brutal fighting, the South Vietnamese forces, with US support, managed to repel the invasion. The North Vietnamese suffered heavy casualties, losing an estimated 100,000 troops. However, the South Vietnamese also paid a heavy price, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed or displaced. The Easter Offensive was a strategic failure for North Vietnam in the short term, but it revealed a critical truth: without direct American support, South Vietnam struggled to hold its ground. The battle severely weakened South Vietnam's military, and just 3 years later, in 1975, North Vietnam would launch its final offensive, capturing Saigon and bringing an end to the war. The Easter Offensive was a preview of what was to come, proving that South Vietnam's days were numbered once US forces fully withdrew. Lessons from history's bloodiest battles. Throughout history, warfare has shaped the rise and fall of empires, redrawn borders, and left entire civilizations in ruins. From the tactical genius of Hannibal at Cannae to the relentless destruction of the Mongols in Baghdad, each battle we've covered has left a lasting mark on history. But beyond the strategies and casualty numbers, what can we learn from these devastating conflicts? One of the most important lessons is the power of strategy and adaptability. Time and time again, we've seen that sheer numbers alone don't win battles. Hannibal's victory at Cannae proved that a well-executed maneuver could completely dismantle a superior force. Meanwhile, the Germans at Stalingrad learned the hard way that underestimating an enemy's resilience can lead to disaster. The greatest military minds in history understood that wars are won not just by strength, but by intelligence, patience, and the ability to adapt. Another lesson is the human cost of war. The Siege of Leningrad showed the unimaginable suffering that civilians endure in prolonged conflicts. The fall of Tenochtitlan demonstrated how conquest can erase entire civilizations, while the Battle of Okinawa revealed just how devastating modern warfare had become. These battles weren't just about military victories, they were about survival, and in many cases, entire generations were wiped out. Finally, history has shown that even the greatest victories can come at a heavy price. The Battle of the Somme was meant to break German defenses in World War I, but instead, it turned into a senseless slaughter with little gain. The Easter Offensive in Vietnam proved that even a massive military effort could ultimately be undone by political realities. And the fall of Berlin, while marking the end of Nazi Germany, also set the stage for decades of Cold War tension. War has shaped our world, and these battles serve as stark reminders of its consequences. The tactics may change, the weapons may evolve, but the cost of war remains the same: devastation, loss, and a history written in blood. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the most devastating battles in history, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Truth Behind History, and let us know in the comments which battle you found most fascinating. If you love learning about history, check out our other videos where we uncover the truth behind some of history's most pivotal moments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. That concludes our exploration of history's most devastating battles. Each of these conflicts reshaped the world in its own way, leaving behind not just ruins and casualty lists, but lessons that continue to influence military strategy, politics, and even the way nations remember their past. The horrors of war are often told through statistics, but behind each number is a story of survival, sacrifice, and human resilience. Whether it was the sheer brutality of the Mongols, the strategic brilliance of commanders like Hannibal and William the Conqueror, or the endurance of soldiers and civilians trapped in sieges like Leningrad and Stalingrad, these battles remind us that war is never just about winners and losers, it is about the cost of power and ambition. History may repeat itself, but by studying these battles, we can better understand the forces that drive conflict and the consequences that follow. If you found this video interesting, make sure to subscribe to Truth Behind History, hit the like button, and drop a comment about which battle you found the most shocking. Also, be sure to check out our other videos for more deep dives into the most fascinating and sometimes forgotten moments of history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.